When you're buying property in a foreign country, I think it's especially important to understand, what are my objectives with this property? What am I going to do with it? How am I going to handle it? What's the future hold? Am I going to sell it? Am I going to hold it forever? Am I going to live in it? Understanding your objectives. It's especially important when you're buying property somewhere other than where you live or other than your home country. And so in this video, I'm going to share with you some good ideas to consider, some things to think about before you buy property overseas. Hey guys, I'm Andrew Henderson from nomadcapitalist.com, and in this video I want to share some of what I've gleaned over the last 12 or 13 years that I've been personally studying and doing real estate deals all around the world, as well as my experience helping and working with and watching people on their own journey to do this and live the nomad capitalist lifestyle. The interesting thing to me from a human perspective, which I think is so important, okay, potentially even more important than the numbers on this kind of stuff, is there's so much more room for confusion when you're doing deals overseas if you're not setting goals. Okay, so for example, we talk here about living overseas. So let's say that you're from the United States as I am, and you say, hey, I don't want to live in the United States anymore. I'm going to go live somewhere else. Well, what do we talk about? We talk about you can be an expat. You can live in one home. You could rent that home, or you could buy a home and live there. We talk about the trifecta approach, having 3 different homes around the world so that you never get bored, and that you can use that for tax optimization. We talk about, for people who don't want to leave their home country, buying property that you can rent out, buying property that could appreciate. We talk about buying property that maybe you want to rent out when you're not there, but whether you live in your home country or you're living overseas, maybe you want to pop in for a month. Okay, there's so many different opportunities in a way that, just investing in your local market you probably wouldn't have. Okay, I lived for years as an adult in Phoenix, Arizona, the Phoenix, Arizona area. I at one point owned a house. And I wasn't just going to go around buying other houses in my neighborhood and saying, well, on Tuesdays I'll live in this house, and on Thursdays I'll go to the one 2 blocks away. If I were to have purchased any other real estate in my city, it would have been, of course, as an investment, right? You're going to live in one and you're going to rent the others. But when you add the element of overseas, and especially from the nomad capitalist perspective, where we're not just, again, passive investors sitting at home in Phoenix and investing everywhere else, we're potentially moving around the world, it adds a lot of confusion. So let me give you some things that you can think about. Keeping in mind, by the way, that I'm not perfect at this either, okay? My goal is to jump in and take action quickly. I'm doing deals around the world, partially because it's just the best way to get in there and learn. I can then share information with you. There are some times when I'm doing deals because there's also an immigration benefit attached, and I can then research that, do it myself, and then offer that to people that we're helping, having already field tested it and making sure it actually works, right? And so I think self-awareness is important. I don't know that you have to necessarily have your entire objectives down. You don't have to stick to one objective for the rest of your life. But being aware that you should have objectives, I think, is the first step to getting this correct. And so the first thing that I would keep in mind, and I mentioned this at one of our real estate master classes that we started recently. Guy asked, how do I make sure I make money in real estate overseas? I said, it's the same way you make money in real estate at home. You make money when you buy. You do the buy correctly, okay? And so if you are looking for that immigration benefit, we had a gentleman recently who said, if I have to waste some money on real estate by overpaying in order to get the citizenship that I want, I'm willing to do that. Now, you may overpay a little bit to get an immigration benefit, and if you can overpay by $10,000 and get a passport, probably worth it. If you're going to overpay by $100 or hundreds of thousands of dollars, that's not worth it, okay? And so if your goal is immigration, we have a lot of people who come to us for help. They say, Andrew, I would like to get a second citizenship. I would like to be diversified. I'd like to have citizenship insurance, but I don't want to go to one of the Caribbean islands and just make a donation. I'd like to make a solid investment, even if it costs more than the donation. At least I know I can get my money back in the future. But the thing to be aware of with these is making sure that you're not, going to the gringo realtor or, buying some off-plan, overpriced real estate, okay? Be aware of your objective. If your objective is second passport, then yes, you're probably not going to get the absolutely rock bottom best deal, okay? We've seen this, for example, in the Turkey citizenship by investment market. There's some really dirt cheap real estate in Istanbul right now in great locations. Those properties are going to be a little bit harder to qualify for citizenship. You're going to need to spend a little bit more, but you don't want to go and buy the most shiny, overpriced thing, okay? So if immigration is your goal, okay, understand that there's a price to be paid for that immigration benefit, okay? A lot of countries set up their residence or citizenship programs to where you have to buy something a little bit more expensive. On the other hand, you don't want to go wild and dramatically overpay. Now, let's talk about the buy itself, the actual real estate deal, okay? This is where you really have to understand what the objective is and what you're trying to do with the property, not only now, but in the future, okay? I've gotten to the point where I want to look 10, 20 years down the line, okay? And so at times, that's going to mean I'll do a deal where it may not be optimal in quite some way, but I feel like, 20 years from now, it's going to be a great deal. Or 10 years from now, it's going to be a great deal. I'm not necessarily looking for the next 6 months or the next 1 year. I'm looking at what's the long-term benefit of this property. So maybe the yield isn't quite as high as I like, but I really believe in the market. Something like that. Okay, understand, what's the long-term perspective for the property. Also, what's the long-term perspective for the country? Okay, you want to buy in a country that's doing well. That should, go without saying. But on the actual metrics of the property, this is an area where I see folks getting confused. Okay, because again, I've talked about in videos over the years, on one end of the spectrum, I'll buy a property that just sits there. And when I go, it's basically my hotel. And I'm not interested in renting it out. I made a video called Why I Keep Empty Homes. I don't want to deal with the hassle, even if it's a suboptimal investment, as some folks might say. I don't want to deal with it. It's just going to sit there. It's ready for me or my friends or people on my team, what have you. On the other end of the spectrum, we've made videos talking about how guys are getting 13% yields and 12% annual growth, and people are making lots of money in real estate in what I believe are very conservative areas, city centers and growing economies. These are not exactly speculative bets in the local market. Okay, and so understanding that wide delta, from 0% return personal lifestyle property to really high return in conservative markets is very important, because what I'll see is when people come to one of these 2 real estate master classes, or when people come and they're working with us just on their plans and we're looking at deals together, what I'll see sometimes is someone will come and they'll say, my goal is 10% yield. Okay, that's a good objective. Now, I do think if you want to hold core city center assets in a capital city in a growing market, that 10% is going to, over the long run, become harder and harder to achieve. It is still achievable, plenty of ways to get there. What I would say, though, is, if you're invested in Australia in some suburb, an hour outside of the city, 9 train stops away, and, you're leveraged and you're making 1.6% after tax, 10% for a place that's in a much more solid location in its local economy may be a little bit aggressive. We want to compare apples to apples. 10% in suburban environments in a lot of emerging cities is very achievable. 10% in the downtown, next to most important monuments may be more difficult. And so, we don't want to be super aggressive to the point where we make it impossible to do a deal. I think people do set themselves up for failure sometimes. So let's say your objective is 10%. People come and say, that's my objective. I would like to make 10%. Okay, fine. We'll go out, we'll start looking at properties, and we'll show them stuff where, hey, you can make 10%. What are those properties going to involve in some cases? It's going to involve a renovation. You walk in. I think the record time of me showing someone a property, they literally poke their nose in, 3 seconds, they're out the door. This is terrible. That property I sold for one of the biggest percentage profits of any deal I've ever done in my life, because the place was so bad and the price was so low that I was able to do the work. It was outsourced to someone while I was basically not in the country most of the time. But we did the work, and it was one of the best deals on a percentage basis. It wasn't a huge property, so the money itself was not a life-changing sum of money, but on a percentage basis, it was one of the best deals ever. And I think almost no one else I showed that property to really got it. Okay, so that's going to be involved. You might have to do a renovation. Properties like that are often not going to be super sexy properties. Again, if you go out further into the suburbs, if you look at markets like Istanbul, some European cities, if you go out kind of on the outskirts, then it becomes more easy. And yes, there is new construction, things are sexy, but you're not really in a location that is necessarily sustainable. Okay, and I've told the story about how when I lived for 6 or 7 months in California, it was in the basically right before the financial recession started, and right before everyone who lived in Victorville, California, up in the high desert, 2 hours from Los Angeles, was getting booted out of their homes that they dramatically overpaid for. I bet a lot of those homes are abandoned at this point. I mean, or they were resold for nothing. If people are living there, they were resold for nothing because there's not a great demand to live 2 hours from Los Angeles. Right? So you have to keep in mind it's apples to apples. And so if you want to make the 10%, there's probably going to be a little bit of work involved unless you want to take on something more speculative in like one of these outskirts areas, okay? So someone will come, they'll say, I want to earn 10%. And we'll start showing them properties. They won't want to do the work. They'll say, oh, this patio is kind of weird or whatever. Or, why is this or why is that? Or particularly folks from the United States will say, oh, there's a nail sticking out from the wall. What if someone, falls on the nail and they sue us into the Stone Age, which doesn't really happen in most of these markets. But what I'll see sometimes is a progression of folks who say, oh, well, you'll show them the new property that is more expensive than they wanted to pay, and the yield isn't quite there, but they just like the look of it, okay? And so I learned this growing up. My mom built several homes, and she had a great ability. She would, she would scribble like floor plans on like graph paper. She would like really get into it. Remember we built the last house that we built when I was a kid. She went into the people who were building the house, and she showed them like this massive portfolio of plans, and hey, I moved your bathroom and I did that, and there's an alcove there now. And they said, most people who buy houses, they just scribble their plans on a Domino's pizza napkin. And they, I don't know, here's a few notes, make it work. And what she taught me was, most people, they can't see the finished product, i.e. that place I paid nothing for and sold for a good profit. They can't see the finished product. They don't have the imagination. Now, I'm not trying to criticize anyone who doesn't have that, but I think if you're aware of it, you can start to see, okay, you can start to think, well, how can I see the potential in properties so that I'm willing to buy these things that are cheaper? Because if you start going and looking, as people sometimes do, at, oh, well, this looks nice. Oh, there's a washing machine, that's nice. Well, now we're getting into turnkey properties from developers where you're going to pay more. Okay, your yield is probably going to be lower. Now it's easier, okay, but you have to understand, are you willing to put in the extra time? Now, one thing that I try and do in our business is say, all right, here's the whole network. You want a renovation guy, you want a kitchen cabinet guy, you want a lawyer, you want a real estate agent, you want someone to rent, you want someone to sell, you want someone whatever. Here's the network, and therefore at that point it's not that much work. When I go into a new market, I've got to build the network myself. And so if you're just going in cold, you'll have to build the network yourself. And so the amount of work that someone who has the network versus someone who doesn't is going to have to do is different. But ask yourself, how much work am I willing to do? And the more work you're willing to do, the higher the return you'll get. It's okay to buy the nice looking property, but you have to be clear in your objectives. And I think that what's really important is there's no perfect deal out there, okay? There's no deal where you're going to pay a very low price total, it's like $40,000, but it's also super cheap per meter, $700 a meter, and the yield will be 13% when you rent it out, and it's going up in value every year, and it's ready to move in, there's nothing to do. Like, that doesn't work. Just doesn't exist, right? I mean, if you own that property, would you sell it for those metrics? No, of course not. And obviously, there are properties for $700 a meter that aren't in that bad of shape. They're in markets like Cairo, Egypt, that I'm looking at right now. And so a lot of people would turn their nose up at Cairo, Egypt, because, oh, that's not safe, and oh, the government, and oh, this and that. So that's the other issue, right? Is your objective to be in a market that has already established itself? I think it's really important. And so, I want to create more self-awareness for folks. I totally get it. I have struggled with these things myself. I'm not trying to be critical. What I think it's important, though, to understand is that when we get confused, and again, I think being overseas, it's a lot easier to be confused because there's so many different things going on. But you have to understand your financial objectives. And I think that you can set one objective, but then it's okay to say, you know what, the 10% yield, that was just me wanting to make a good deal. I think as entrepreneurs, as guys in particular, we want to feel like we did a good deal. You know, we want to be like, yes, I made a good deal. Sometimes you don't necessarily need the best deal, okay? And there's kind of the next objective. The next objective to understand is, how do I want to use this property? Okay. Do I want to live in it full-time? Do I want to live in it occasionally? Or, you know, part of my trifecta, or as a pop-in, whatever. Do I want to rent it out on Airbnb? Do I want to rent it out long-term? Okay. Understanding the use of the property, I think, is equally important to understand the metrics. Now, certainly the two go hand in hand. Okay. You might get a higher yield with Airbnb or vacation rentals. On the other hand, depending on where you're investing, they may come in and either the building or the local government may come in and ban short-term rentals. So that's a risk to understand. And what would you do in that case? This is another area where I think people sometimes, you know, get confused. This is an area that I struggle with sometimes. You know, you're buying something, and listen, sometimes it's just a good deal to say, hey, you know what, I'm going to buy it, and it's a great deal, and just consider the worst case scenario. I'll leave it empty. Okay, would you still do the deal if you had no return? Those are the kind of deals that I like to do, by the way, assuming that I would live there, because if I have to make 10% cash flow, and that's the only way that it's a good deal, that's generally not interesting to me when I have to get 10%, right? You buy these properties with guaranteed, you know, rental income, which are almost always overpriced. It is, you know, that's the only thing the property has. You know, it doesn't have as much intrinsic value as the price. You're relying on that yield. I don't want to have to rely on the yield. I want the yield to be the gravy. But anyway, you know, understanding, you know, what's the use case for this property, okay? And I think, you know, being very clear on that is important. Do you want to spend time in this city? Okay. Doing Airbnb because you'd like the option to visit there, just because you like the idea of having options, even though really you don't want to visit there, but you just want to keep your options open just for the sake of keeping options open, I think is not a good idea. I would probably rather do a long-term rental in that case. There's no right or wrong answer to any of these questions, but I think asking yourself and being honest with yourself is really important. And so many options swirling around. I think the desire to do a good deal and to be smart and not to feel like you overpaid is important. I get it. You know, when you go into a new market, you don't know all the metrics. But asking yourself these questions before you do a deal, I think it's going to help you do much better deals. It's going to help you buy at the right price. It's going to help you get the best out of the property, get the most money out of the property. Obviously, you want to ask yourself, you know, where's this market going in 10 years? That's another question. That's obviously an important one as well. But I think also by asking these questions, you're going to have a much greater sense of peace. I can tell you, you know, people ask here on YouTube all the time, you know, how do you manage all these properties? I think it's a lot easier when you remove the emotional stress of not knowing what your objectives are. That to me is almost as important as the financials, because then you can go out and do even more deals, and the financials will take care of themselves. How can Nomad Capitalist help you? 4 ways. Number 1, subscribe to our channel and click the notification bell to make sure you get our new video every day. Number 2, get a copy of Nomad Capitalist, the book. You'll learn a lot of my personal experiences over a dozen years of studying this stuff, as well as exactly some of the strategies that you can use to build your Nomad Capitalist plan. Number 3, if you're not sure where to start, but you want to come and learn from my team and I, you want to come and mingle with like-minded people, learn more about our live conference, Nomad Capitalist Live. It's coming up soon. And number 4, if you want some help right now because you've got a burning issue, you need something solved, you want to lower your taxes, get a second passport, or build the Nomad Capitalist lifestyle of your dreams, go to nomadcapitalist.com and click on Become a Client.